I once believed that time could heal all wounds, that if you simply said, "I'm sorry," with honesty, people would forgive you. But I was wrong. That day was my son Bryce's 34th birthday, my only child. I stood outside his apartment in Seattle, holding a small gift box that contained a letter I had spent 2 weeks writing. I wrote, tore it up, and wrote again, until my hands trembled too much to hold the pen. All I wanted was for him to open the door, just to hear me say one sentence: "I'm sorry, son." But the door stayed shut. I heard footsteps behind me. Bryce walked past, his eyes as cold as those of a stranger. Not a word, not even a glance. He took out his keys, unlocked the door, and closed it gently behind him. The sound of that door closing felt like something breaking inside my chest. I stood there for a long time, until the rain began to fall, and the letter in my hand blurred into wet ink. I wondered, are there mistakes that can never be redeemed by an apology, and can love, when it comes too late, still be called love at all? I didn't know. All I knew was that on that day, I lost my son for the second time. There's something I used to tell myself for comfort. At least I tried. I tried to be a good mother. I tried to raise my son with my own 2 hands after losing my husband. I tried not to let anyone see how weak I was. But now, looking back, I realize sometimes all that trying can turn a person cold. And I was the perfect example of that. Benjamin and I bought a small house on 73rd Street, Southside Chicago, back in 1995. Bryce was only 5. A little boy who loved splashing in the rain and asking hundreds of whys. I remember the first day we moved in. He ran from room to room, laughing through the empty house, then sat on the floor and watched the rain outside the window. "Mom, I can hear the rain singing," he said, pressing his hand against the glass. "The rain doesn't sing, sweetheart," I laughed. "It does!" Grown-ups just can't hear it. Sometimes I wish I were still the kind of woman who could hear the rain sing. But life doesn't sing. It screams. It demands. It takes everything from you. Benjamin passed away in 2003, a stroke during his night shift at the machine shop. I didn't cry in front of Bryce. I just held his little hand at the funeral and said, "Mom's got this. You just have to study hard." From that day on, I was both mother and father. I taught at Washington Elementary by day and at a skills center by night. On late nights, while grading papers, I'd hear Bryce snoring softly in the next room and tell myself, if he has a good future, then everything will have been worth it. I believed real love was teaching your child to be responsible. No spoiling, no leniency. When you grow up poor, you learn that tears don't pay the bills. Bryce was a bright kid, gifted even, but he also had his father's soft heart. He loved to draw, to write poetry, to make music. I was different. I feared anything without a clear path. "You can't make a living with songs, Bryce," I told him when he asked to join the music club. "But Mom, I love music." "Love doesn't pay for college, son." He went quiet, eyes clouded with sadness. That was the first time I saw distance in his eyes, small at first, but it kept growing. Bryce was brilliant. He got accepted into the University of Illinois with a partial scholarship, and I pushed myself to cover the rest. I remember the day I drove him to campus. We hugged in the parking lot. I said, "I have nothing to give you but faith. Don't let me down." He nodded, tears glistening. "I'll make you proud, Mom." And he did. 3 years later, he was among the top students. I bragged to everyone at work, pinned his photo on the fridge, a medal for all those years of struggle. But when you've endured enough hardship, you forget that others deserve freedom too. I controlled everything about him, his bank account, grades, even the friends he hung out with. I called every night, asked what he'd eaten, what he'd studied, who he was with. If he didn't answer, I'd call his roommate. He never argued, but I could see it. His smile was fading, little by little. During Bryce's final year, a credit company came knocking. Benjamin had left behind a mortgage, and I thought I'd paid it off. Turns out there was unpaid interest. I panicked. If I didn't pay, they'd take the house. And that house, it was everything. The place my son grew up, where my husband's ashes rested. So I did the one thing I still can't forgive myself for. I withdrew all the money from Bryce's scholarship fund, $14,000, to cover the debt. I'm just borrowing it, I told myself. I'll return it after a few months of tutoring. But life never gives you those few months. I was diagnosed with cardiac anemia and had to stop teaching for a while. Then came the medical bills, the medication. Everything spiraled. By the time Bryce found out, it was too late. I still remember that day. Tuesday, April 3rd, 2013. Bryce came home holding his bank statement. He didn't say a word for the first 5 minutes, just looked at me with eyes I'll never forget. "Mom, did you take my tuition money?" "I just borrowed it, honey." "I'll pay it back." "Borrowed? Do you realize my next semester's payment is due next week?" I had no other choice. "You always have a choice, Mom. You just never tell me," he shouted. I'd never seen him like that before. The room shook, like every bottled-up emotion from 20 years was breaking loose. I tried to speak, but my throat closed up. "I did it to keep the house, Bryce. I didn't want you to lose your home. But you never let me leave. You kept the house. You kept me. Everything had to be under your control." He packed his things and left that night. No goodbye, no hug, no glance back. The door slammed, the glass on the table shattered. I sat there in that empty room, feeling like the world had just walked out on me. The years that followed passed like fog. I taught less. My health declined. The house grew quiet, only the ticking of the clock. Every morning I brewed 2 cups of coffee, then poured one away. Habits die hard like hope. I wrote letters to Bryce. The first went out in September 2013, the second in October. By the 6th month, they all came back stamped address unknown. I tried emailing him. No reply. I visited his office. The receptionist said I wasn't on his contact list, so I stepped back. All I could do was quietly follow him online. He got promoted, bought a house, got married. The bride was beautiful, her smile radiant. And me, the mother, nowhere in the picture. Every night, I woke to the distant sound of trains. On my desk, a pile of unsent letters. I had written, "I'm sorry," 100 times, and erased it each time. Because apologies don't always bring forgiveness. I knew Bryce wasn't just angry. He was broken by lost trust. And once trust shatters, love turns into a wall. One night, I went to our old church. Pastor Raymond was still there, silver-haired, gentle-voiced. I told him everything. He was silent for a while, then said softly, "Margaret, sometimes even God waits a lifetime to hear, 'I'm sorry.' But what he cherishes most is the one who dares to say it, even knowing they may never be forgiven." Those words stayed with me for 8 years. I began a strange ritual. Every year on Bryce's birthday, I sent him a small gift. Nothing expensive, a book, a pair of knitted gloves, a short note. I didn't know if he opened them, but I kept sending them. I remember his 30th birthday. I included an old photo of the 2 of us. On the back, I wrote, "My son, if one day you're ready to listen, I'm still here." The package wasn't returned. That alone made me cry the whole night. 8 years later, this March, I decided to go to Seattle. I found Bryce's address through a mutual acquaintance. I prepared carefully, neat clothes, brushed hair, a letter rewritten 5 times, and a small gift box with Benjamin's old watch, the one Bryce used to love. It was pouring rain. I stood in front of the apartment for 20 minutes, afraid to press the buzzer. In my head, hundreds of memories flooded back. His laughter, his college entrance exam morning, the night he fell off his bike. Then, the door opened. Bryce stepped out, talking on the phone, his eyes accidentally landing on me. He froze, disbelief flickering across his face. "Bryce, what are you doing here, Mom?" "I just wanted..." To wish you a happy birthday." He glanced at the gift box in my hand, then looked away. "I don't need anything from you anymore. Just let me say one thing. You've said too much already." And he walked past me, like a stranger. The door closed, softly, but my heart felt crushed beneath 1,000 stones. I stood there, rain soaking my hair, the letter in my hand dissolving word by word. They say rain washes everything away, but no one tells you it also makes pain seep deeper. I left the building after dark. Under the streetlights, my shadow stretched long, like the memory of a mother who tried so hard to do right, yet lost everything. Back at the hotel, I opened my phone and looked at the last message I'd sent 8 years ago. "My son, I'm sorry." And below it, the tiny gray line read, "Seen 8 years ago." I laughed, a soundless laugh. Maybe now I finally understood. Sometimes silence is the clearest answer. The next morning, I looked at myself in the mirror. More gray hair, deeper lines, but the eyes staring back were still a mother's, still full of love. I touched the glass and whispered, "Margaret, you've lost so much. But at least you still have a heart that can feel pain." And so I decided to write everything down, from the beginning to the end, not to justify, but so that if one day Bryce finds it, he'll know his mother never stopped loving him. She just loved him the wrong way. 3 weeks after that fateful day in Seattle, I returned to Chicago. The old house was still there, quiet, as if time itself had forgotten it. Dusty windows, peeling paint on the steps, and the neighbors almost entirely changed. Only I remained the same, still here, waiting for something I didn't even dare to name. That afternoon, the phone rang. A woman's voice came through, gentle, unfamiliar, yet warm. "Are you Ms. Margaret Price?" "Yes, who's this?" "I'm Janelle, Bryce's wife." I nearly dropped the phone. My heart pounded so hard I had to sit down on the wooden chair by the window. Janelle, a name I knew only from a wedding photo online. The woman I both admired and envied. Her voice was soft, a little shaky, but firm. "Bryce doesn't know I'm calling. But perhaps we should talk." I agreed immediately, without thinking. That rare chance felt like the first breeze after a winter far too long. We met at a cafe called The Lantern on the corner of 9th and Maple. It used to be the place my husband and I sat in our younger years, when our dreams were as simple as a home and a little car. Janelle arrived first. She wore a beige sweater, her curly hair tied high, her face bearing the calm of someone who knows how to hold her feelings. But her eyes, those eyes held an unspoken worry. "Have you been well?" she asked. "Still breathing, so I suppose that counts," I replied, half joking, half true. She smiled, though there was a sadness to it. "I'm sorry for calling out of the blue. I just think there are things Bryce doesn't want to hear, but perhaps needs to know." We sat in silence for a few minutes. Amid the whir of the coffee grinder and the smell of baked goods, I could hear my heart trembling. Then Janelle opened her bag and took out an old envelope, its edges yellowed. "Do you recognize this?" I took it. It was one of the letters I had sent Bryce in the first year after he left. Pale yellow paper, my shaky handwriting from back then. But there was something on the corner of the envelope that made my throat tighten. A smear of dried blood. "Bryce kept it in a drawer," she said. "I stumbled on it. At first I thought he'd forgotten it, but it looks like he's read it many times." "He still kept it?" I whispered. "He kept it, but never replied." Janelle paused for a moment, then lowered her voice. "There's something else. In the letter you wrote that you did it because of the house debt. Bryce doesn't understand. He thinks that's just an excuse. I used to think so too, until last week I looked at her, heart thudding." "Last week?" "Yes. When I was reorganizing the garage, I found an old file box. It was the 2002 mortgage paperwork, in Benjamin's and your names. I saw a line that said, "Loan renewed without notice." "May I ask, Miss Margaret, what does that mean?" I swallowed, steadying my voice. "It means the bank automatically renewed the loan after my husband died. I wasn't notified, and by 2010, they were calling the house due." Janelle went very still. "And you had to pay it off?" "Yes. I didn't want Bryce to know. He was about to graduate then, and I was afraid if I told him, he'd quit school to work." The silence stretched long enough that I could hear the spoon clinking in the cup at the next table. "You took the money from his fund to save the house?" "Yes." "And hid the truth?" "I thought I was doing the right thing. But sometimes the right thing destroys everything." Janelle bowed her head, her hands tightening together. "If it were me, I might have done the same." I looked up, stunned. For the first time in years, I heard words that made me cry without shame. That evening, Janelle asked to visit my old house. She said she wanted to understand where Bryce grew up, as if only by doing that could she touch the part of his past he'd never speak of. We entered the house after the light had faded completely. The smell of damp wood and time mingled together, everything like an old photograph fading away. On the shelf still sat our family portrait. Me, Benjamin, and 6-year-old Bryce. She touched the frame lightly. "He really does look a lot like his dad." "Yes, but his temperament is his mother's. Stubborn, but easily hurt." Janelle turned to me, her gaze steady. "Do you ever think he's angry with you, not over the money, but because you didn't trust him?" The question cut like a small, precise blade. I sat down, staring at the picture on the wall. I trusted that he would succeed. I trusted he needed a home to come back to. But maybe I never trusted that he was strong enough to stand on his own. Janelle was quiet. After a moment, she took a small USB drive from her bag. "Could you watch this?" "It's a video Bryce once recorded." My hands trembled as I took it. She plugged it into the laptop she'd brought. The screen lit up, and a familiar voice filled the dim room. "Tomorrow I'm moving out. I don't want to hate Mom, but if I stay, I'll never grow up." Bryce at 24, thin, red-eyed, standing in front of that familiar wooden door. I covered my mouth. Tears fell onto the keyboard, spreading over the enter key. "Mom, I won't come back until you understand. Love isn't holding tight. It's letting go at the right time." The video ended. We sat in silence. Neither of us spoke. That night, after Janelle left, I sat alone under the kitchen light. The USB still lay on the table beside the unsent letter. I opened it. Inside was a half-written letter, the one I'd meant to send Bryce when he got married. I never sent it, thinking he wouldn't read it. "My son, I know there are things you'll never forgive, but I hope you understand. Sometimes grown-ups are afraid too. I was afraid of losing the house, of losing the past, of losing the image of myself in your eyes. I did the wrong thing because I thought it was the only way to keep you near. But now I understand. Tying you with a rope of guilt will never be real love." I folded the letter and set it on the table. Outside, the wind whistled through the window. I closed my eyes and listened to the rain begin. And for the first time, I let myself sob out loud. Near midnight, my phone rang. It was Janelle. Her voice was low, as if she were afraid someone might overhear. "Ms. Margaret, Bryce knows I went to see you." I went cold. "Is he very angry?" "No, he didn't say anything. He only asked me one question. Do you believe her?" "And what did you say?" "I said yes. Because a liar wouldn't hold on to a house that once cost her everything." I let out a small laugh, choked with tears. "Thank you, but don't ask him to forgive me. Forgiveness is something the heart has to grow on its own. Janelle was quiet for a moment, then said, "Could you do something for me?" "What is it?" "If you can, write this story down. Not for Bryce. For yourself, I didn't sleep that night. I opened a notebook and wrote, as if each word were my last breath." The next morning, Janelle returned with a file folder and my husband's notebook. "I think you should have these back," she said. I opened them. On the last page, Benjamin had scrawled, "If one day I'm no longer here, keep the house for Bryce. No matter what, keep it." I smiled, a smile wet with tears. So we both made the same mistake. Janelle took my hand, touching it as if it were a memory. A mistake can still be love if we dare to fix it. She looked around the room, her eyes stopping on the photo on the wall. "I'll show this to him." "I'm not sure he'll listen." "He doesn't need to listen. He just needs to see." 3 days later, an email arrived from Janelle, with a video attached. Subject, "For her eyes only." I opened it. Bryce was sitting in the living room, the one I had visited. Warm light slanted through the window. He looked straight into the lens. His face was still firm, but his voice trembled slightly. "Mom, I don't know what Janelle told you, but I understand now. I read the paperwork, reread your letters, and I saw something I never wanted to see before. The fear in your eyes. I used to think you controlled me to make me dependent, but now I get it. You were just afraid of losing me. I can't go back to how things were. But maybe it's time for us to stop being silent." He paused, exhaled. "If you're willing, I want to see you. At the place you used to take me, Jackson Park, by the old stone bench near the lake." The screen went dark. I sat there, hands shaking, tears spilling faster than I could wipe them away. That afternoon I went to Jackson Park. A gentle wind stirred. The lake mirrored the sky like glass. I sat on the old stone bench, where 30 years ago I'd taught Bryce to count the ducks gliding past. A figure approached. It was him. No longer the little boy from long ago, but a grown man, broad-shouldered, eyes deep, and in them, not hatred, but something else. We sat in silence for a long time. No hug, no flowery words, just side by side, looking out over the water. "I don't know where to start," Bryce said softly. "Starting with silence is fine," I said. I clasped my hands, then spoke. "I'm sorry I thought you needed saving. The truth is, I'm the one who needed saving." Bryce turned to me, his eyes shining. "I didn't know you were so ill." "There's a lot you don't know. But if we knew everything, life wouldn't be any fun." We both laughed, a small, brief, but genuine laugh. As the sun went down, Bryce stood and said, "I'm not ready to forgive, but I'm ready to listen." I nodded. That's enough. And so, after 8 years, we spoke again, not as mother and son, but as two people learning how to begin anew. There was still pain in my heart, but for the first time in a very long while, I felt something strange, hope. I remember so clearly the day I saw Bryce again at Jackson Park, that afternoon when sunlight fell in scattered flecks over the lake, and the breeze carried the scent of new grass, like a prelude to something beginning. He didn't say much, only, "I'm ready to listen." That sentence was a small beam of light cutting through the 8-year darkness inside me. I thought that would be enough to believe we could start over. But sometimes a single light breeze is enough to pry off the lid you've kept clamped down for years. 3 days later, Bryce came to my house without warning. He stood at the door, holding a stack of old documents. His eyes were nothing like they'd been in the park, cold and taut like a string about to snap. I was about to invite him in, but he opened the door himself and walked straight into the living room. "I found this at the bank," he said, tossing the papers onto the table. "It's the deed transfer. With your signature? And someone named Frank Wallace. Do you know him? I froze. That name was a ghost from the past tightening around my throat. Bryce looked straight at me. Dad worked for him, didn't he? And he's the one you used to cover up that Dad stole money from the company. The air thickened. I could hear my heart pounding like a war drum. You're wrong, I tried to steady myself. Your father didn't steal, he just— Stop it, Mom, he snapped. You always have a reason. Your whole life is— I only did it because I only wanted what's best for you. But you never tell the truth. He spoke, his voice shaking like he was holding back something about to explode. You took my tuition money, I forgave that. But it turns out you hid Dad's death as well. He didn't die of a stroke, did he? I looked at my son, a man's face now, but in his eyes was the child who once asked me, Mom, why isn't Dad coming home from work? I no longer had the strength to lie. Yes, I exhaled. Your father died at the shop. He collapsed in the middle of the night shift, an envelope of cash still in his hand. He took that money to pay Grandpa's hospital bills. He didn't have time to return it. Bryce was silent, his lips trembling. And you re-signed the mortgage with Frank Wallace to shut them up. You buried everything to keep the honor of a man who couldn't even keep himself together. I answered softly, I did it, so you wouldn't grow up ashamed. Well, I'm ashamed anyway, Mom, he said hoarsely. Not of him, of you. He turned away. I reached out, but my hand caught nothing but air. The door closed. The sound was soft, but my heart cracked into pieces. I don't remember how long after that I fainted. When I opened my eyes, the ceiling was stark white, the smell of antiseptic, an IV line in my arm. The doctor said I'd had a mild heart attack. Thankfully, a neighbor called in time. I asked only one question. Has anyone told my son? They shook their heads. I laughed, and tears spilled out anyway. Sometimes the only thing that keeps a heart beating is the memory of someone who has left. When I woke again, Janelle was by my bed. She held my hand, her eyes red. He doesn't know you're in the hospital. I'm afraid if I tell him he'll leave for good. Don't tell him. He's had enough, I whispered. If one day he wants to know, let him come on his own. Janelle shook her head, her voice thick. You don't understand. He still keeps his childhood photo. Every time he's angry, he takes it out. If people don't love anymore, they don't do that. Those words were a small spark in the dark. A week later, after I'd been discharged, Mrs. Ruby, my old neighbor, stopped by. She brought a dark, weathered wooden box and set it in my hands. It's from Benjamin. He left it with me before he died. Said when Bryce is grown, give it to you. I opened the box. Inside was a cassette tape with a faded label, for my son. My hands shook so much I had to slot it in twice before it would play. Benjamin's voice sounded rough and low. Bryce, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone. I took money from the company to save your grandpa. I planned to put it back, but I didn't make it. Your mother took all the blame for me. Don't blame her, son. She's the strongest person I've ever known. His voice broke, then cut off. I held the cassette player close, tears dripping into the speaker grill. I sent the recording to Janelle by email with a note. You know what to do. That evening she called back, voice shaking. He's listening. He's crying. He said his mother covered for 2 men, and both of them left her alone. I was silent for a long time, then answered only, he understands now. Rain fell over Chicago for 3 straight days. It beat against the window like the tapping of memories. I remembered Bryce at 5, in a yellow raincoat, holding out his hands to catch the drops. Mom, I can hear the rain singing. Back then, I only laughed. But now, in an empty house, I heard the rain too. The saddest song of my life. I didn't hope he'd come back. I only hoped that one day he'd understand that truth, even late, is the only way two people can begin again. On Wednesday night, the door opened. I thought it was the wind, until I heard footsteps. Bryce stood there, raincoat soaked, the wooden box in his hand. Without a word, he set it on the table. "I heard everything," he said quietly. "Now I know what you did to spare us from shame. I used to think you were too strong, but it turns out you were just trying to survive." I tried to smile, my voice rough. "None of us is innocent, Bryce. It's just that I chose silence, and you chose anger." He lowered his head, eyes red. "Do you still have the photo of me in the yellow raincoat?" "Yes, I kept it." "Could I have it?" I took the picture from my wallet and handed it to him. He looked at it for a long time, then said, in a voice so soft it seemed afraid to break the air, "I'm still not ready to forgive, but I don't want to hate anymore." I nodded. "That's enough, son." Bryce stepped back to the door and paused in the rain. I watched his silhouette blend into the silver water streaming down the street. This time, the door didn't slam. It closed softly, gently, like a farewell between two souls who had learned the way home. That night, I sat by the window and listened as the rain thinned. There was still pain in my heart, but it had changed. No longer the scream of guilt, but the warmth of acceptance. Forgiveness isn't the erasure of the past. Forgiveness is when you can remember without trembling. And in that quiet night, I understood. There are apologies that don't need to be heard to become complete. They only need to be spoken, with all of one's heart. After that rainy night, Bryce didn't come back right away. I still woke up every morning, brewed 2 cups of coffee, one for myself, one for memory. But this time, there was no desperate waiting left in me. Just a quiet stillness, like someone standing by an old grave, not crying anymore, just laying down flowers. A week later, the phone rang. It was Bryce. His voice was husky, uncertain. "Mom, how are you?" "I'm fine. And you?" "I'm okay." He paused for a few seconds, then said softly, "I'll come home this weekend. There are some things we need to do." I knew it wasn't a promise of reconciliation. It was just a small bridge, and I didn't dare run across too soon. Bryce arrived on Saturday afternoon. He came with gloves and tools. "The rain messed up the roof," he said. "I'll replace the panels. You could have just hired someone. I'm free." We worked together quietly, only the sound of hammering, nails, and the wind sliding through the cracks. For the first time in almost 10 years, the house sounded like 2 people lived in it again. That evening over dinner, Bryce said, "I'm thinking of selling this house." I froze. "Sell it? This is your father's house." "I know, but you can't stay in Chicago forever. You've got heart problems, and the house is falling apart. I want to turn it into a scholarship fund for mechanical students." In Dad's name, I looked at him. For the first time, there was no anger in his eyes, only purpose. "You want to turn your father's mistake into something good?" "Not just his. Yours. Ours." I nodded. "If that's what you want to do, I'll sign." We spent the whole week clearing out the house. Every object was a slice of memory. Benjamin's old work clothes, Bryce's 5th grade certificate, the curtains I'd sewn by hand. Each time I picked something up, my heart ached, but also felt lighter. One morning, Bryce found a box of broken crayons. "I drew this for Dad." He never got to see it. He smiled faintly, then fell silent. And in that quiet smile, I saw a man learning how to forgive without saying it aloud. Friday night, we sat on the porch watching the streetlights shimmer on the wet pavement. I told Bryce about the first night after his father died, when I cried while helping him with homework. I was afraid that if I cried too loud, you'd stop believing I was strong. So you hid it? Yes, hid it so much I forgot I was allowed to be weak. Bryce chuckled softly. You don't have to be strong anymore, Mom. I'm old enough to carry the rest. That sentence, I'd waited 20 years to hear it, not because I wanted to lean on him, but because I wanted to be trusted again. The next day, we brought all the documents to the law office. Bryce had asked Janelle to prepare the paperwork to establish the Benjamin Price Fund. When I signed my name, my hand trembled. Not from age, but from the feeling that I was finally putting a period at the end of a very long, painful sentence. The lawyer asked, "Are you sure you want to relinquish ownership of the house?" I looked at my son and said, "I'm not giving it up. I'm passing it on." Bryce took the pen and signed beside me. 2 signatures, 2 generations. Finally side by side on the same page, bound not by guilt anymore, but by trust. When we stepped outside, it started to rain again. I pulled my collar up. Bryce laughed. Seems like it rains every time we make peace. Maybe God's trying to wash off a little more of the past. We walked along Lake Michigan. The rain was light, but the wind was strong. Bryce talked about work, about Janelle, about plans to have a baby. I listened, like meeting a new person, not interrupting, not advising. And then, in the middle of that rain, he suddenly said, "Mom, I forgive you." I turned, about to ask why, but he went on, "Not because you said sorry so many times, but because I'm tired. Carrying anger makes the heart heavy. I want to live lighter, the way you once wanted for me." I didn't say a word. I just reached out and took his hand. The rain fell between us, mixing with tears, and no one could tell which was which. Months later, the Benjamin Price Scholarship Fund was inaugurated at the University of Illinois. It was a small ceremony, quiet, intimate. Bryce gave a short speech. My father made mistakes. My mother did too, but they taught me the most important thing, that honor doesn't lie in never falling, but in getting back up and making things right. The room erupted in applause. I sat in the back row, feeling as light as air. On stage, my son stood tall, confident, and in his eyes, I could see Benjamin smiling. That evening, Bryce drove me back to my hotel. Before saying goodbye, he asked, "Mom, are you going to keep writing?" "Writing what?" "Your story." "If you don't write it, I will. People need to hear about mistakes that end with grace." I smiled and nodded. "If you tell it, make sure you say this too, that sometimes love given at the wrong time is still love." He hugged me, the first time in years. And there, in the heart of Chicago that night, I could feel his heartbeat against mine, no distance left between us. I returned to the old house one last time before handing it over to the fund. In the living room, only the old window remained, looking out onto the row of bare trees. I placed on the windowsill a photo of 5-year-old Bryce, wearing his yellow raincoat, grinning at the sky. Then I wrote the final lines in my notebook. If someone asked what I regret most, I'd say, I regret taking so many years to learn how to say 3 simple words. I'm sorry. But if they asked what I'm most grateful for, I'd say, I'm grateful my son still had enough grace to hear them. On my way out, it began to rain again. I didn't open my umbrella. I let each drop touch my face, warm, clean, alive. Today's rain didn't sound sad like the old years. It sang. And for the first time, I heard its song with all my heart. 12 months after the inauguration of the Benjamin Price Foundation, I moved into the Rhodes Community Center, a small red brick building in Chicago's South Side that Janelle helped me apply for. It was peaceful there. White daisies and lavender filled the courtyard. In the mornings, I taught a class called Writing for Healing for women who had known loss. In the afternoons, I watered the garden, brewed tea, and listened to the laughter of children playing outside. Sometimes I thought, perhaps this was the home I had been searching for all my life. One day in class, a young woman named Renee sat quietly at the back. She didn't speak much, just scribbled in her notebook. When I asked, "What are you writing?" She whispered, "I'm writing a letter to my mother." "But she's gone." I smiled. "That's all right, dear. The ones who leave still listen. They just don't answer right away." She looked at me, tears welling up, and murmured, "You sound just like her." I didn't know what to say. I simply placed my hand on her shoulder and said softly, "Sometimes we don't get to choose how to say goodbye. But we do get to choose how to live so that goodbye doesn't go to waste." That night, I returned to my room and opened my old notebook. Inside was my trembling handwriting from years ago. "My son, if I'm gone one day, please remember I always loved you. I just didn't know how." I smiled. Now, I finally knew how. That afternoon, as I was sorting papers, the phone rang. An unfamiliar number. A familiar voice. "Mom, it's me." I froze. My heart raced, just as it had the first time he ever said that word. Mom. "Bryce? Is everything okay?" "Yeah, I want you to come to the first scholarship ceremony. Janelle says it won't mean anything without you there." I paused, then laughed through the lump in my throat. "You say that like I still matter." "You're my mom." "You always matter." The next morning, I wore my lilac dress and Benjamin's old pearl necklace and caught the early bus to the University of Illinois. On the ride there, I couldn't help thinking of the first time I'd brought Bryce here. When he was a skinny freshman, carrying a battered suitcase and a smile bright enough to light the road ahead. Now his shoulders were broader, his gaze steadier, but that same smile remained. The ceremony was held outdoors. On stage hung the banner, the Benjamin Price Foundation, First-Year Awards. Bryce spoke briefly. He never looked directly at me, but I knew he knew I was there. I used to think forgiveness meant forgetting. Now I know it means looking back without fear. Today, we're not just giving scholarships, we're giving chances to those who once thought they didn't deserve one. Applause rippled through the crowd. I glanced at Janelle. She was smiling, her belly round and full, a new life on its way. My heart softened completely. I hadn't only regained my son. I was about to meet my grandchild. After the ceremony, Bryce found me behind the stage. "Were you standing too long, Mom? You tired?" "No, I can still survive a few boring speeches." He laughed, then handed me a framed photograph, the one of him in the yellow raincoat, now captioned, "To the woman who taught me how to start again." Tears blurred my vision. "You know," I said, "when you were little, every time it rained, I'd drag you inside so you wouldn't catch cold. But now I think I was the one who needed to learn how to stand in the rain." Bryce squeezed my hand. "Well, you're standing here now, aren't you?" In the weeks that followed, I returned to Rhodes' house with a light heart. I started a new class, Letters We Never Sent. Women of all ages came, one writing to a husband long gone, one to a father, another to a child who'd run away. I read each letter, and in every story, I saw a fragment of myself. One woman asked me, "Ms. Margaret, did you ever get a letter back?" I thought for a while, then smiled. "No, but I got something better. Peace." At the end of the year, the center hosted Stories of Healing. They asked me to tell mine. The lights dimmed. The small hall held barely 30 people, yet you could hear every breath. I stood, holding the microphone, speaking slowly, as if talking to my past self. Someone once asked me, "What's the hardest thing for a mother to learn?" I think it's learning to let your child leave your arms without fearing they won't return. I lost my son because I held on too tight, and found him again by letting go. A middle-aged woman began to sob. I paused until her crying softened, then continued. "I once told my boy that rain doesn't sing. But now I hear it every day. Because every drop reminds me, no pain is meaningless if you're willing to listen to it." When I stepped down, the audience stood and applauded. At the back of the room, Bryce stood with red eyes, Janelle's hand in his. They both smiled, and I knew then I was truly forgiven. That night, back in my room, I opened the window to the garden. Moonlight spilled in, the breeze gentle. On my table lay a new letter from Bryce. "Mom, I read some of your students' essays on the center's board. I wonder, if you could rewrite your whole story, what would you change?" I laughed softly and wrote beneath his letter, "Nothing, son, because without those mistakes, I would never have learned how simple love can be." I pinned the letter to the wall beside a photo of Benjamin and Bryce. 3 faces, 3 generations, all looking forward. The following March, when the center opened a new semester, Janelle gave birth to a baby girl. Bryce video called me right from the hospital. "Mom, meet Amelia." A tiny bundle, rosy brown skin, big dark eyes. When the doctor placed her on Janelle's chest, her first cry was strong, determined. I laughed through tears. That cry sounds exactly like her father's once did. Bryce smiled. "Her middle name is Margaret." I hope you don't mind I choked up. Mind? No, sweetheart. That name has finally been loved again. A few months later, I flew to Seattle to visit them. The apartment was full of laughter, the smell of cookies, and the soft cry of baby Amelia. That evening, Bryce let me hold her on the couch. Sunset light streamed through the curtains, golden and warm. Amelia wrapped her tiny fingers around mine, gripping tight. In that moment, I saw the circle complete. A mother who once didn't know how to love, now loved in return. Not through words, but through a baby's small hand. "You know, Bryce," I whispered, "if one day she gets angry with you, don't be afraid. Sometimes that just means she loves you too much." He smiled. "I understand. Thank you, Mom, for still being here to teach me that." That night, as I lay on the couch listening to the rain against the window, the memories came back. But this time, they didn't hurt. Each drop was a note. The familiar song of my life. The rain is singing, and I am listening. The next morning, before leaving Seattle, I wrote a letter for Amelia and left it in a small drawer. "Dear sweetheart, when you grow up and one day don't understand your parents, don't be angry too quickly. Grown-ups were once scared little children too, and if you ever feel lonely, remember, love never disappears. It only changes shape. Sometimes it hides in the rain, in a hug, or in an apology said too late." I folded the letter, sealed it, and wrote on the envelope, "To be opened when she's ready." On the flight back to Chicago, I looked out the window. White clouds stretched endlessly below. I thought of Benjamin, of Bryce, of Amelia. 3 generations, 3 melodies from the same symphony. I used to fear time would steal everything. Now I know. Time doesn't take away. It teaches us how to love deeper. When the plane landed, Chicago was draped in light rain. I didn't open my umbrella. I walked through it, feeling peace settle in my chest. If one day I'm gone, I hope people won't remember me for the tragedy, but for learning how to listen when the rain began to sing. And if anyone asks what this story is about, I'll say, it's about a mother, a son, and how they found each other again, not through memory, but through mercy. My dear friends, if you're still trying to be forgiven, or trying to forgive someone, please don't rush it, because it took me nearly a lifetime to understand this. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering without hurting anymore. I used to be a mother who hid her tears behind strong words. I once lost my son, and then found him again in the rain. And now, all I want to tell you is this: love, even when it comes late, is still love. Don't be afraid to say, "I'm sorry." Don't be afraid to say, "I miss you." And don't be afraid to begin again, because sometimes the most miraculous things happen in the very moment we think it's too late. If this story touched something deep in your own past, if you saw a part of yourself somewhere in my voice, then stay with me, because every week I'll share another journey of love, pain, and healing. I'm Margaret. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of my story. Don't forget to hit subscribe, because who knows, the next story might just be the one that makes you smile after a long, heavy day. Let me tell you, when the rain begins to sing again,